It's hard to know where to begin today, if I'm honest, in this ongoing several-year conversation called Hints and Guesses, and which is a line from T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets. He says, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. Yeah, the breaking forth of the eternal. He calls it earlier in the poem the intersection of the timeless and time. He says that's the preoccupation of saints, the intersection of the timeless and time, and for the rest of us, that intersection is half guessed and half understood. And I don't know, that's what this podcast is about. And that comes from my own craving and longing and wondering, and as much as I can, trying to turn my attention toward what only can ever be half understood. And yeah, and I guess it's hard to know where to begin, because in some ways I want today to be a bit of a personal podcast. Like, I don't know, it's hard to say, are my other podcasts not personal? And what do I even mean by that? In fact, a friend of mine not that long ago said, I feel like on the one hand I know a lot about you, and on the other hand I hardly know anything about you, and you don't often share private details. And there are reasons for that, and I want to talk about that. I want to share some things, and I want to share my own reservation. And I want to talk about what feels like to me a threshold space. Like, here I am in my mid-40s, and I can feel that I've left and I'm leaving a certain chapter of my life, a certain house that I've inhabited. And I've kind of carefully arranged all the furniture in this house, and fixed the window glazing, and painted the rooms, and rearranged the furniture, and hung up the artwork, and given away the books that no longer speak, and held on to the ones that do. And sort of like when everything's been carefully arranged and I finally sit down in my chair, there's another knock on the door, and there's a cloaked figure there, the cloaked figure of the unknown, saying it's time to leave. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the blessing and difficulty of leaving home base again for me. So that's where I'm headed, and I hope you'll hang with me, and I'll do like all my what I have going on maybe at the end instead of here at the beginning. So the first thing I want to say is, which I said in my last podcast, is, hey, I'm moving to Georgia. I've been living in Michigan for a long time now. My wife and I have been married almost 25 years, and the first 7 years of our marriage, we moved 7 times, and which is insane. But really, for the last good chunk of time, we've been here in Michigan, and I've been in this house on Grand River Drive in Ada, Michigan, for actually I'd have to do the math, but over 8 years, I think. It's definitely the longest we've lived anywhere. And it's a beautiful piece of property. Our house was built in 1850, and it has these gorgeous elm trees, and there aren't many left in Michigan, and beautiful black walnut trees, and it's all the stuff you would expect from a house in 1850, built in 1850. Always needs something, and we have these amazing apple trees too, and this old variety of apples they don't really even plant anymore, and it's been a real gift. And so we're leaving here and we're moving to Georgia. My wife's from Georgia. Her entire family lives in the same small town, and Georgia has been a kind of what would I call it? A sort of a centering point in our life. We've been going down there several times a year, well, since we've been married, and our kids have too. And when we think about holidays like Christmas, we think about Georgia, and about like 15 years ago or so, I bought some land down there. I went in with my brother-in-law, and we violated Dave Ramsey's, advice, and bought some land on a balloon loan, hoping we could pay it off, and we did, and it backs up to some family property, and we always knew, we sort of felt that we'd end up in Georgia one day, but you know how it is if you have kids. It's like school and schedule, and what the kids are into is what becomes consuming, and all of a sudden, almost like with no warning, although I suppose like I could have asked anyone who has kids that have gone through high school that, hey, this ends, and like all of a sudden, my oldest daughter is done with culinary school. She's getting married this summer. My son has graduated from high school and is going off to college, and my youngest just turned 13, and all of a sudden there's like a window, and what seemed like kind of something we would imagine and talk about and wonder about suddenly became possible, and the time felt like now. If not now, when? I think that's a kiva in the rabbinic literature. If not now, when? And and it kind of happened suddenly in a way. But now I'm sort of in the aftermath. I let C3 know where I work, and a place I love. I've been teaching at C3 in Grand Haven for 5.5 years, and it's the longest I've held a job in a single place, really. And it's been such like I said, a gift in my life, and it's strange because I'm leaving something I like doing, and so that feels good in a way, instead of, I don't know if you've ever left a job before where there's a lot of contention or uncertainty, or a kind of a no, or you get fired. I've been fired before. But this feels different. It feels good to say goodbye, and there's some grief with that, but it also feels like the right thing. It's time for me to move on, but I'm in that place where I've said I'm leaving, and now all these, sort of, I don't know, dominoes are falling, and it kind of starts to take a life of its own, and I'm in that place. And so we'll be moving in a couple months, and heading down to Georgia, and and I want to say something that I hope, it's personal, but I'm encouraging you to think about the relationship between a private life, maybe even a private spirituality, and what's for public consumption. This is a major tension in my life, being a public speaker and a writer, and I make these podcasts, and I say things occasionally that are going on. It's going on from me. And what is that dynamic, and what's for public consumption and what's not for public consumption? And I've always felt this tension. And some of this, I'll just admit some of my own hangups, but I grew up in a household where my dad was a preacher. My grandpa was a preacher too. And my grandpa was kind of like a bard. He was kind of sing-songy, and he had this like Irish accent, and he was always, you'd feel the sermon building up to a point, and he would switch to a little kind of Irish saying, or more often a hymn. He'd start quoting a hymn, and like obscure verses from some hymn that no one knows about. And that was his kind of sing-songy, musing kind of preaching. And my dad was a different kind of preacher, and he was quite funny and likable, and wanted to be clear, and loved Greek words and what they mean, and like any preacher, especially evangelical preacher, the best sermons are the sermons that involve some disclosing some family ordeal or story or mishap. And so most of my life, different stories or scenes from my childhood were on public display. My dad would weave in, something that happened on vacation, or something, funny that one of us kids did. And, that gave me kind of a strange feeling, because on the one hand, I felt sort of liked and honored, what's the right word for it? Sort of special, I guess. That's the simplest way of putting it. I feel special, and a certain kind of maybe even notoriety, would follow that. But then also, over time, the experience of hearing some story being told, I also had another curious feeling that sometimes most of the time I would try to push down, but there was like some discomfort, and the discomfort was something like, that's not exactly what happened. That's kind of what happened, but you're conveniently telling the part that is proving your kind of theological point here. And maybe more importantly, I wouldn't have been able to articulate this obviously when I was a little kid, but it's something like, well, that's not the way I would put it. That's not what happened to me. That's a version of what happened. And that's often what happens when people like me tell stories about life. And, even my own book, Bitten by a Camel, that's my perspective on what happened to me in Israel. And if you want to know what my wife thought about our life there, and you'd have to ask her. And the way I put it is not the way that she would put it, for sure. And so anyway, I've always felt this tension. In fact, when I started working for Mars Hill, I would have this debate with Rob, and about kind of how much should you include your kids in a sermon or not? And we would kind of go back and forth. And, my kind of perspective at the time was like, no, don't, tell your own stories. Don't tell their stories, kind of thing. And that was my sort of bias. And anyway, we had this kind of healthy back and forth about this. And when social media came along, I realized that the temptation and the ease with which to put others on display was readily available at my fingertips. And what people really want to see is, a picture of your kids, or a picture of your spouse, or show us your kitchen when it's messy, show us show us what's real life. And this also made me uncomfortable too. And I remember a few heated arguments with extended family members about what's permissible and what's not to put on social media. And we as a family had some boundaries around that. In fact, even today, we have a rule in our house, which is if you're going to post something, I mainly use Instagram, but I have a Facebook account too that I occasionally check, and they're linked anyway. But if I'm going to post something in any picture at all that involves my kids, my wife, even our house, then we have to ask the other for permission. And if it's not granted, then we don't post it, or if later on someone becomes uncomfortable with it, we take it down. So it's kind of the way that we've tried to walk this line of having a private life and even a private spirituality and what's for public consumption, because the fact that I'm in, I hate to even say this, but the world of spirituality, or the business of spirituality, talking about spiritual stuff makes it even, the terrain even more difficult, because I'll just put it personally, if my private spirituality becomes the thing that I'm making public, then I don't have a private spirituality. I don't have a still small voice anymore. I have something else. And I remember Rob one time even saying, one of the things that we've decided as a family, is Rob Bella, sorry, that I'm talking about. He said, once we put something out there, like something that's happened to us, it's no longer ours. If I tell a story in public, I've given it away. It doesn't have the same, it's not mine anymore. And then it takes on a life of its own. And I guess that's a good way of looking at it. If you're going to say, like, if I take what I talked about in Bitten by a Camel, I've now given it away and it has a life of its own, and people will hear what they want to hear and take what they want to take from it and reject what they want to reject about it, and project onto it what they want to project onto it. And it's no longer mine in the same way. And I think that's an important distinction. And I think that's why, Jesus says that terrible line, which he says, don't cast your pearls before swine. And, most people hear that, and what they hear is the word swine. And it's like, oh, so-and-so's not worthy to hear my, precious insights or something. And actually, I think what Jesus is saying is that it changes the nature of your own pearl. It changes the nature of the gift that you've received, the hint, the guess, half understood, that's barely forming, that's shifting your own life, the spirit, the still small voice. It changes the nature of the pearl. And so maybe it's not so much about the other person, it's about the secret work. It's about the desert work. I was on the Pete Holmes podcast a while ago, and 5 years ago, when Bitten by a Camel came out, and I don't know, we were just like, there was no agenda. We were just kind of riffing on things, as he likes to do, and anyway, we started talking about the Vision Fast, and I had just come off of Vision Fast, and he was kind of excited about that because there's related terrain. He's into psychedelics, or was anyway, and so, what's a vision, and what about altered states of consciousness, and how is that related to a fast, and what happened? And you just want to know what happened out there. And all of a sudden, this Goethe line came to me, tell a wise person or else be silent. I think he follows that with, tell a wise person or else be silent for, I don't know if he says the unwise, it's not exactly it, but it's something like that. The unwise will mock it right away. And, obviously it wasn't a slam on Pete, but it's this same thing. It's the same terrain. It's like, tell a wise person or else be silent. We have to be honest about social media is not the realm of wisdom, is not the wise person. And this makes me extremely uncomfortable right now in our what I would call a kind of cult of vulnerability right now. Like being real is being vulnerable, and whatever I'm feeling is what's true, first of all, and what I then put out there in the world. And TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and whatever. I'm sure there are like 5 other things that I don't even know about right now. And they're all bowing down at the altar of vulnerability, supposed vulnerability. And it's become like in a way a kind of cult. And one of the things I've learned as I've been, training to be a guide in this realm of spirituality, and descent to soul is the language we use at Animus. And one of the questions we often ask is something like, to ourselves and sometimes out loud, but who's the one speaking here? And that's a fair enough question when it comes to what we put out there in the world and why we put it out there in the world and what we need from making ourselves, quote, vulnerable in the world. And it's very toxic terrain. That's what I would say. Kind of in an attempt to be authentic, the world has turned toxic, to use an overly used word right now in spiritual circles. I think it is, at least. And I don't know. So I think it's important to ask questions of set and setting and context, and to wonder, well, what is my spiritual life here, and what do I need to hold? Not as like some kind of no one is worthy of my precious spiritual stuff. That's not what I mean at all. But what do I need to hold silently long enough so that it can do its work? And yeah, and I don't know if I want to say much more about that, other than to, I don't know, let it hover out here. And so, as much as I'm telling you what's going on in my life, I think I'm trying to take responsibility for what's my story and what's not my story, and when is it appropriate to. Maybe I should say one more thing, that I think it's the ego that loves story, and almost like as quickly as possible, it wants to make meaning. And sometimes the orientation of the egoic self, is to make a sort of meaning that props up its own view of the world. And okay, that's fair enough. That's what we do sometimes. We construct a world that defends our persona and our idea of who we are, and we love to tell stories that prop that up, and whether they're stories of our own wounds or our own gifts. And yet to me, the mystery of a soul path, of really sinking beneath the surface of our egoic patterns, of who we think we are, it involves moving into some unknown terrain, and we want to be careful to not make a story too quickly. And I'm preaching to myself. And as I said, I'm in a threshold kind of place, and maybe what's true about being in a liminal space, in a betwixt and between, is that meaning making mechanism is suspended for a moment, for a month, for a year, for 5 years. I don't know. We can't quite do it, or it doesn't quite feel right. It's waiting. It's waiting. There's a kind of self-emptying that's happened. To use a word from the New Testament, a kenosis, an emptying. Or maybe, like, here's an image. I love the story of Jacob wrestling I was going to say the angel. Technically, in Hebrew it says a man. A man comes to him and wrestles. And then later on, we come to understand this as a kind of angel or even God. But it just says a man initially. Ish is the word in Hebrew. Anyway, before he wrestles, before this night wrestling match, which is a wrestling match of identity and meaning and purpose and who am I and blessing, and I've got a poem I want to read to you at the end called A Blessing in the Dust, and it's a poem by Jan Richardson, so hang on for that. And anyway, this wrestling match, but before he does it, before he meets this man, at night, he sends over the river all of his possessions. He's married and he's got kids and goods, and he's been away from home for a long time. And he sends all this stuff across the river, and he's, in a way, they're now naked. And that's an image for threshold space. It's like when we're leaving something, when we're leaving our first house of belonging, to quote David White, and when we're leaving a certain way of relating to our own life and a job and a role or a marriage or a family or a geographical place, and it gets sent across the river, and we're more empty. We're actually more vulnerable. We don't need to post about it. We're feeling our own fragility and our own limits. And it's in our limitations and with our limitations that the wrestling match begins. With our soul and with God and with the mysteries and with our own longings and desires and with our own griefs and a wrestling match with our own wounds. And that's that pregnant and potent liminal space that is both a womb and a tomb at the same time. It's a tomb because it's a death of what once was, and it's a womb because in the mystery of the cave, the possibility of newness begins to grow. We're pregnant with possibility, but uncertain of any guarantee. And it feels alive. It can feel challenging for sure, but for me at least, it feels alive. And this kind of threshold space. Maybe the simplest way of saying is that I've left, or I've nearly left, and I haven't arrived. And wherever I'm arriving is yet unknown. See, it's not really, and that's what's funny, because I'm saying I'm moving to Georgia. Yeah, but I'm moving, and much of that is still unknown for me. I really don't know. And I don't know how exactly I'm going to make a living. I don't know, maybe more importantly, the relationship between physical place and the terrain of my own psyche. Because one of the things I believe about the soul is, I'll borrow a line from Bill Plotkin. He one of the many images he uses for soul is he calls it an ecological niche, which in one way is trying to say the soul is natural. It's not a product of the mind. It's like it's as physical as the tree outside your window, and it can be and is rooted in a place. And I'm just taking it one step further, that the soul or the whole psyche is in relationship with the real world. I'll use fancy words, with a bioregion, but just with land, with place, and with story, the story of a place. And I don't know exactly what it will be like, and how I might change, and how I might find a kind of grounding in a new place. And this move definitely, I have some hints and guesses. It feels more final in a way. This pull, one never knows, but I have now it's like my consciousness has shifted from what am I going to do with my life to, well, what about my kids and maybe even my grandkids? And Georgia feels like having a multi-generational conversation. You know, my wife's grandmothers are still alive in their 90s, and brothers and sisters-in-law and parents and cousins, and you know, I'm the son of an immigrant. Most of my extended family lives in still in Northern Ireland, and on my mom's side there aren't that many relatives, and it's almost like very much the opposite. And I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know what will change and what will shift. It's more unknown than known. And what I carry with me is my imagination and of course my gifts and my own wounds and longings and sense for home. And it's like home in the deeper sense. I'm following. It feels like I'm following that thread, and home as belonging, and who knows where the hand of mystery might lead. And I was reading some Evelyn Underhill. She's wrote the most famous book on mysticism, and she says mysticism, I'm going to demystify it with her definition here, is broadly speaking, there's a quote, broadly speaking, I understand it to be the expression of the innate tendency of the human spirit towards complete harmony with the transcendent order. Which, first of all, I love. She says, it's not for the, I'm interpreting, it's not for the saint, you know, it's not for Buddha or Jesus. It's an innate, I'm going to add some words, universal tendency of the human spirit toward complete harmony with the transcendent order. It's like, that's that homing device. It's that's that internal, non-negotiable compass that longs for increased harmony and wholeness with the eternal, with the transcendent order, with the intersection of the timeless with time. And then she adds, whatever be the theological formula under which that order is understood. You know, she's saying, I don't care what tradition or lack of tradition you come from. We have this innate pull, and I hope on one level I'm not just, you know, moving to a new state, you know, to a small rural town in middle Georgia, you know, but I'm also, I hope, following that innate longing for harmony with the transcendent. It's like both, and they're tied up together. The timeless and time, the eternal and the ordinary. That's the intersection. It's not like my spiritual life is somewhere else. It's also in the annoyance of packing up this damn house. Holy shit. Like how did I get to be the person who has this much shit? You know, it's like, yeah, and that too, you know, where's the intersection of the timeless and time? And yeah, so yeah, that's a little of what's going on for me. And yeah, and I guess I want to say, just practically speaking, I'm going to try to make a living as an artist. And I guess maybe I've always been doing that. And when I was a little kid in the fourth grade, I remember saying to myself primarily, I'm going to be an artist. I mean, I was asked, like, on one of those little sheets of paper, you know, what do you plan to do with your life or something? And I put artist, and I think I meant drawing. I did love drawing. I used to go to the woods and draw, and I wouldn't say I have like enormous talent for it, but I kind of meant that, but I don't know what it was. There was something about that maybe I just wanted to turn my attention toward what's beautiful and meaningful, and create something in the world. And I don't, who knows? I'm sure when I said that, I didn't know an artist. It's like I was following someone's lead. But anyway, I don't know what made me think of that, but it's like, I'm going to try to make a living. And so that means this podcast is going to become a lot more important. And of course I won't have my weekly teachings at C3. So, I'll be able to spend a little more energy and time in, trying to host this conversation. So I hope you'll help this podcast grow, and you can help it grow by becoming a patron, of course. And the 71 people who are my patrons, I want to thank you really sincerely for every dollar on up that you give each month. You make it happen, and it's going to become a lot more important going forward. So if you want to become a patron, please do so. It supports me directly. But you can really support the podcast by passing it on. I hardly ever say, hey, don't forget to, I hardly ever say, pass it on. And so I'm saying, yeah, pass it on. Let people know if there's an episode that you like or that you don't like for whatever reason, or you partially like, or it stirs you up in some way. Yeah, extend the conversation. And I'd love for it to grow, and my guiding work is becoming a lot more important to me. I've been in this guide training program at Animus, which is not actually called a guide training program, for the last 7 years. It's called the Soul Apprenticeship and Initiation Program, and that's really what it is. We're apprenticing as best we can to our own soul, our own shape, our own mystery, and surrendering to the process of the mystery initiating us into the work of guiding, but maybe more importantly into following the soul's thread, to use a line from William Stafford. And anyway, that's really what it's about. I call it the guide training because that's a lot of what we're actually, we're learning how to be better listeners and guides. And but it's not like completing the Soul Apprenticeship and Initiation Program makes you an Animus guide. I mean, I do hope to be an Animus guide down the road, but that's a separate process. I'm just apprenticing to the work. And so anyway, working one-on-one with people and doing my own retreats and programs and online stuff has become a much more central part of what I'm up to in the world, and that will only increase. And it's funny working with one-on-one with people. It's been the single biggest surprise and I think gift in my life. It's like I'm changed by it, by the privilege and sacred relationship and container that is co-created in the intimacy of that kind of conversation. The conversation about what is my actual life? What is my spiritual life? Where am I? What's actually happening? What's happening beneath the surface of my life? So I've been. It's when I was a pastor, if I got an email, or back then I had an administrative assistant. If I got a message from her, someone wants to meet with you, I would be like, I don't really want to meet with somebody. And, that's partly because I had my own hangups about that and meeting with the pastor. And I don't know where I heard this, but the clerical collar, in other words, being a minister is like, the clerical collar is a giant projection screen, which I think is a funny and clever way of saying people come with a lot of projections. And if you're not, if you haven't found the ground, or at least part of the ground of your own essence, the ground of being, your own being, what Thomas Merton would call the true self, or even a taste of the true self, then you're in real trouble in that kind of position. And that's partly why I had to step away from that world if I was going to grow up. And but anyway, back then I would have really resisted that, and I never would have imagined that a huge part of my life would be working one-on-one with people and loving that and learning from that. Life, I don't know, life, maybe a clue that the mystery is the real agent who's at work is that you can't predict your own life. I don't like the kind of spiritual-ish language right now of manifesting this or that. Like, I'm just going to manifest. Like, who's the one doing the manifesting? Is it the ego? Is it your persona? Is it some image you have of yourself? And who's to say what you're, quote, manifesting is? You can manifest all the way to your deathbed and miss the subtle promptings of the real change agent at work here, the God mystery, who maybe wants to blind you like St. Paul and lead you by the hand, or who wants to swallow you like a fish and take you into the whale's belly so you can hear a song you've never heard before, stuff like that. Yeah. And so anyway, I don't know if there's more I need to add there. I'm going to keep writing. I do hope to publish a book in the next year. And I've kind of promised that on this podcast a couple times. And I'm on book number 3 or 4 right now, unpublished. I'm just slower. I wish I was like some of my friends who can crank out a book every 6 months. I'm just not. And I think it goes back in a way to what I was saying about private spirituality and what's for public consumption. And for me, things take time. And actually what's in Bitten by a Camel took a long time to ever come out. My wife said to me, the funny thing about this story, which has now become so publicly, part of your own, life, was that when you returned from Mount Sinai, you didn't even tell me really what happened. And it kind of slowly trickled out and sheepishly. And I remember one time telling an Israeli friend of mine what happened to me on Mount Sinai, and he was like on the floor laughing. And I was like, I wasn't even trying to be funny. I was just saying, I climbed Mount Sinai and I got bitten by a camel, and he just thought this was the funniest thing that ever happened. And I wasn't trying to make meaning of it. And I think by no conscious effort of my own, over time, it started to reveal its own secrets. Had I turned it into a sermon, when I got back or something, I would have killed it right there on the spot. And I think that's what's happening to me now. It's like 5 years have gone by since I've put out a book, and all right, now it's time, and enough time has passed for me to share a few hints and guesses. So anyway, writing and guiding and podcasting and doing retreats and programs, that's what I'm going to do. And if I can't do it, if I can't make ends meet, I'll build houses, and who knows? I don't know. And that will be good too. Yeah, maybe that's as much as far as I want to go. I want to end with a poem. I want to end with a beautiful poem that my wife showed me the other day. It's called A Blessing in the Dust. And I don't know how I'm going to read it here, and maybe I'll read it twice. I'm not sure. I might stop a few times. This is what she says. You thought the blessing would come in the staying. And this is, I don't know if you've ever felt that before. You thought the blessing would come in the staying. I'm going to ride this out. The noble thing to do is to stay put. Those are my words. You thought the blessing would come in the staying, in casting your lot with this place, with these people. Yeah, and that's what it feels like. Ah, the blessing. I mean, that's that old craving. That's the innate. What does Evelyn say? The innate tendency of the human spirit toward complete harmony with the transcendent order. that kind of blessing. Yeah, and where will I have a taste for that? Well, in the staying with these people, with this place. And there's a kind of nobility to that, I think. In learning the art of remaining, and it is an art, it's a beautiful, and maybe there is a kind of blessing in remaining, in staying, in casting your lot with these people in this place, with this landscape, with this weather pattern, with the second cloudiest place in the United States during the winter. That's West Michigan. I think Seattle has us slightly. You thought the blessing would come in the staying and casting your lot with this place, with these people, and learning the art of remaining, of abiding. And now you stand on the threshold again. Again, you stand on the threshold. The home you had hoped for and ached for is behind you. Not yours after all. The clarity that comes as small comfort perhaps, but it comes. Illumination enough for the next step. For me, that's what it feels like. I really don't know. But there's a little clarity that just for the next step. As you go, I hope you can hear, if you're in this kind of place, I hope you can hear the blessing she's trying to give you here. As you go, may you feel the full weight of your gifts gathered up in your two hands. I love this image of the gifts gathered up in your two hands because, especially like, quite literally, I'm packing boxes, and that's not really the stuff I'm carrying. And as you go, may you feel the full weight of your gifts gathered up in your two hands, the complete measure of their grace in your heart that knows there is a place for them. There's a place for your gifts. There's a place for them, for the treasure that you bear, like for the pearl, as Jesus would say. I promise you, there is a blessing in the leaving, in the dust shed from your shoes as you walk toward home. There's an allusion to what Jesus says about passing your peace onto a town, and if they don't receive it, to shake the dust as you leave, to shake the dust of the place from your shoes as you leave. You should find that passage. I don't want to spoil it, but she's alluding to that. So there's a kind of power, there's a potent and almost dangerous power in what she's saying, and also a kind of beauty. I promise you there is a blessing in the leaving, in the dust shed from your shoes as you walk toward home. Not the one you left, but the one that waits ahead. The one that already reaches out for you in welcome, in gladness for the gifts that none of you could bring. I promise you there's a blessing in the leaving, in the dust shed from your shoes as you walk toward home. Not the one you left, but the one that waits ahead, the one that already reaches out for you in welcome, in gladness for the gifts that none but you could bring. My hope is, as always, you hear a hint, a guess, and a clue in my many words, in my too many words, I'm sure. I hope you hear a hint, a guess, a clue in this poem by Jan Richardson. And I hope you hear her blessing for the gifts that only you can carry. And I can't thank you enough for listening. I'm surprised that this podcast is still going. I just reached 200,000 downloads, and I think I have like 80 episodes. So I'm not. This isn't Joe Rogan or something, but it's not nothing. And I'm just amazed that it's alive in the world, and thank you for being a part of that. And you can check my website if you want to know what's going on. I leave tomorrow. I'm leading a small retreat in Colorado, and then I have a little bit longer Wilderness Within intensive at the end of June, and there are spots open. I'd love to have you come, and it is my favorite kind of work, working with people outside. And there'll be an opportunity to fast. You don't have to on my Wilderness Within intensive at the end of June. There'll be some solo time. There'll be ceremonies. There'll be conversation at a beautiful place in Big Rapids, Michigan, which is about an hour north of where I live. And I might in future years still do programs in this spot. I absolutely love this spot. It's on private land owned by an artist, but it backs up to some federal land that you can really feel. You can wander in a way where you'll not be disturbed. So I want to invite you on that. Now I have 3 Israel trips in the works, which is amazing. So end of February, beginning of March, one is cooking up here, and I've got a group of interesting people coming, and I've got one April 1st as well, April 1 through 10. That's with Denver Community Church, Michael Hidalgo. We've been leading Israel trips together. I think this will be 5 or 6 for him. So every couple years we do one together, and I think I'll have one in the fall as well. But you can check my website. As things develop along those lines, and we'll also have some online stuff available coming up here shortly. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself, like all the stuff, like too much future work. I have to focus right now on being here in Michigan, and I don't know, leaving well enough. And so I'm not going full steam ahead with all of my future plans, but those are at least a few things that are coming. And anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.